Every night, thousands of people sleep on Los Angeles streets, forgotten by a world that rushes past their pain. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, two broken souls find each other in ways that change everything. When Marcus Wellington, a successful black millionaire, encounters Sarah crying alone on a park bench after losing everything, he sees something others miss. Her quiet dignity and devastating loss reminds him of painful struggles from his past he's tried to forget. What begins as a simple act of kindness becomes something deeper when Marcus makes an impossible promise that will test them both. But what happens when the woman he's trying to save holds dangerous secrets that could destroy the life he's built? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The December evening air carried the scent of jasmine from nearby Beverly Hills Gardens, mixing incongruously with the urban exhaust that never quite left downtown Los Angeles. Marcus Wellington adjusted his Italian leather jacket as he walked through Pershing Square, a route that had become his Thursday ritual for the past 3 months. At 52, he moved with the measured confidence of a man who had earned his place in the world, though the slight hesitation in his step near the park benches revealed a heart still searching for something he couldn't quite name. The woman on the bench hadn't moved in 20 minutes. Marcus had noticed her during his previous walks through the square. Always the same bench, always holding herself with a posture that spoke of better days. Tonight, the soft orange glow of the street lamp caught the tears streaming down her face, and something deep in his chest tightened with recognition. "Excuse me," he said, approaching slowly, his voice carrying the warmth that had made him successful in business and beloved by his small circle of friends. "Are you all right?" She looked up, startled, her hand instinctively moving to wipe her cheeks. In that moment, Marcus saw past the weathered clothing and unwashed hair to the woman underneath. Her eyes held an intelligence that homelessness hadn't dulled, and a dignity that poverty couldn't strip away. She reminded him of his foster mother, Mrs. Chen, who had maintained her grace even when the electricity was turned off and dinner came from the church pantry. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice hoarse but educated. The lie fell between them like a physical thing, transparent and brittle. She turned her face away, embarrassed by her tears, by his witnessing of her vulnerability. Marcus settled onto the far end of the bench, careful to maintain respectful distance. "My name is Marcus. I've seen you here before. You don't have to talk, but you don't have to be alone either." Sarah, though he didn't know her name yet, studied him with the wariness of someone who had learned that kindness often came with strings attached. But something in his patient silence, the way he didn't push or probe, made her shoulders relax fractionally. "Sarah," she offered quietly. "Sarah Martinez. It's good to meet you, Sarah." Marcus pulled out his wallet, a worn leather piece that had traveled with him from his army days through his first successful business venture. Inside, alongside his credit cards and business licenses, was a faded photo of himself at 18 in his military uniform, thin and hungry-looking, sending half his pay back to Mrs. Chen. "I know this might sound presumptuous, but would you like to get something warm to drink? There's a diner across the street." Sarah's gaze fell to her hands, and Marcus noticed the thin gold band on her left ring finger. It was the only piece of jewelry she wore, but she turned it constantly, a nervous habit that spoke of recent loss. The ring caught what little light there was, a small beacon of the life she'd once lived. "I don't have money for coffee," she admitted, the words seeming to cost her something vital. "I'm buying," Marcus said simply. No strings, no expectations. Just one person offering another person a cup of coffee on a cold night. The diner smelled like bacon grease and coffee that had been brewing too long, but it was warm and bright, and Sarah's shoulders lost some of their defensive tension as they slid into a corner booth. Marcus ordered coffee and pie for both of Them, noting how Sarah's eyes lingered hungrily on the menu before she forced herself to look away. "I used to be somebody," Sarah said suddenly, her fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug as if drawing life from its warmth. "I had a house in Pasadena. Not big, but it was mine. Tom, my husband, he was a high school teacher, math. He loved those kids like they were his own." Her voice caught, and she paused to sip her coffee. "We weren't rich, but we were happy. Really happy." Marcus listened without interrupting, recognizing the need to speak that came from too many days of enforced silence. He understood the weight of being invisible in a city of millions. "Tom had a heart attack at school," she continued, her thumb working the wedding ring around her finger. "Massive. The kids called 911, but by the time the paramedics got there—" She shook her head. "He was gone, just like that. 47 years old, and he was gone." The familiar ache of sudden loss resonated in Marcus's chest. His own father had died when Marcus was 12, dropping dead on a construction site while Marcus was at school, learning about fractions and not knowing his world was ending. "The medical bills," Sarah continued, her voice becoming matter-of-fact in the way people adopt when emotions become too overwhelming. "Tom didn't have life insurance through the school. Budget cuts, you know. And the hospital bills, the ambulance, the funeral. It all added up so fast. I tried to keep the house, worked 3 jobs, but it wasn't enough. The bank took everything. I've been on the streets for 8 months now." Marcus set down his coffee cup, the porcelain making a soft clink. "Against the saucer. Where do you sleep? Shelters when I can get in. Sometimes the bus station. There's a place under the overpass where some of the other women gather." She looked directly at him for the first time since they'd sat down. "You're wondering why I don't just get a job, right? Everyone asks that." "Actually, I wasn't," Marcus replied. "I was wondering how you've survived this long while maintaining your dignity. That takes tremendous strength." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to come from relief rather than despair. "You try to get a job when you don't have an address, or a phone, or decent clothes for an interview. You try to explain gaps in your employment history, when the gap is, 'My husband died and I lost everything.' People look at you like you're contagious, like poverty is something they might catch." Marcus nodded slowly. He remembered similar looks from his childhood, the way store clerks watched him and the other foster kids, the assumption that their circumstances reflected some moral failing rather than simple misfortune. "I started Wellington Tech with borrowed money and a laptop computer in a studio apartment in Koreatown," Marcus said. "This was 1998, and everyone said the tech bubble was going to burst, that a black kid from the foster system had no business trying to compete with Stanford graduates who had trust funds." He smiled, but it carried more sadness than triumph. "They weren't entirely wrong about the bubble. I lost everything twice before I figured out how to build something sustainable." Sarah studied his face, taking in the expensive watch, the quality of his clothing, the confidence that came from financial security. "But you made it." "I made money," Marcus corrected gently. "Success is more complicated than that. I have a company that employs 47 people. I have a house in Beverly Hills that's too big for one person. I have more money than I'll ever spend. But I eat dinner alone most nights. And I take walks through downtown because my neighborhood is too quiet, too perfect. Sometimes success just means you're lonely at a higher altitude." The diner had grown quieter around them, the dinner crowd giving way to late-shift workers and insomniacs. Sarah had eaten half her piece of apple pie, the first decent meal she'd had in days, though she tried to make it last. "Why did you stop to talk to me?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "My foster mother used to say that every person carries a story that would break your heart if you really listened. She was right about that, but she also taught me that sometimes when you're drowning, the only thing that saves you is someone else throwing you a rope, not because they have to, but because they remember what it felt like to go under. And you've been underwater more times than I care to count." Marcus's voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully processed but not forgotten. After high school, I joined the army because I needed structure, needed someone to tell me I was worth something. Did 2 tours overseas, learned discipline, learned that I was stronger than I thought. When I got back, I used my GI benefits to study computer science. But learning programming syntax doesn't teach you how to navigate boardrooms full of people who went to prep school with each other. Sarah leaned forward slightly, drawn into his story. How did you learn? Slowly. Made a lot of mistakes. Had doors slammed in my face more times than I can count. But I had one advantage. I had nothing left to lose. When you've been written off by enough people, you stop caring about their approval and start focusing on proving them wrong. The waitress refilled their coffee cups, and Sarah noticed that Marcus left generous tips, the automatic courtesy of someone who had worked service, jobs, and understood their difficulty. Small gestures, but they revealed character in ways that grand proclamations never could. I don't know what I'm going to do, Sarah admitted, the confession seeming to surprise her as much as it surprised Marcus. I keep thinking Tom is going to come home, that this is all some terrible mistake. I know it's not rational, but grief isn't rational, Marcus interrupted gently. It doesn't follow a schedule or respond to logic. It just is. Sarah's hand moved to her wedding ring again, and Marcus noticed a small inscription on the inside that caught the diner's fluorescent light. What does it say? He asked, nodding toward the ring. She slipped it off and showed him the engraving. Forever and always TNS. Her voice was barely a whisper. He saved up for 6 months to buy this ring. It's not worth much, but it's worth everything, Marcus finished. It's proof that you were loved, that your life had meaning before all this happened. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the ring resting on the table between them, like a bridge spanning the gap between her past and present. Marcus found himself thinking about his own empty house, about the guest rooms that had never been used, and the dining table set for one. Sarah, he said carefully, this is going to sound crazy, and I want you to know there are no strings attached, no expectations. But winter is coming and the nights are getting colder. I have a guest house behind my main house. It's small, but it has heat and running water and privacy. You could stay there while you figure out your next steps. Sarah's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Maybe that's exactly why I can do it, Marcus replied. Sometimes it's easier to trust a stranger than someone who might judge you based on who you used to be. The offer hung between them, impossible and terrifying, and filled with more hope than Sarah had felt in months, but she learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. What would you want in return? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Nothing, Marcus said, and meant it. Well, maybe some company for dinner once in a while if you felt like it. That house gets pretty quiet. Sarah slipped her wedding ring back on, the familiar weight settling against her finger. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive clothes to the man who had once been as lost as she was now. I can't just be someone's charity case, she said. If I stayed, I'd need to contribute something. I'd need to work. I run a charitable foundation through my company, Marcus said. We help people transition back into housing and employment. I could use someone with organizational skills, someone who understands what people in transition actually need. It was a lifeline thrown across an impossible distance, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than despair. I used to manage Tom's classroom volunteer program, she offered tentatively. Coordinated with parents and community. Organizations. That's exactly the kind of experience we need, Marcus assured her. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. This offer isn't conditional on you working for me. The guest house is yours regardless, for as long as you need it. The job offer is separate and only if you want it. Sarah's eyes filled with tears for the 3rd time that evening, but these were different, tears of possibility rather than despair. Why? She whispered. Marcus thought of Mrs. Chen, who had taken in foster children not because the state payments were generous, but because she believed every child deserved a chance. He thought of the army sergeants who had seen potential in an angry, scared kid from the system. He thought of all the small kindnesses that had shaped his path. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said simply. "And because I think sometimes we meet the people we're supposed to help right when they need us most." Outside the diner window, Los Angeles continued its restless existence. Millions of people living parallel lives that rarely intersected in meaningful ways. But at a corner table over coffee and apple pie, two people who had been strangers an hour ago were discovering that connection could happen in the most unexpected moments, that redemption sometimes wore the face of a stranger willing to trust. Sarah's wedding ring caught the light one more time as she reached across the table to shake Marcus's hand. "All right," she said, her voice steady for the first time all evening. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." 3 days passed before Marcus returned to Pershing Square, though Sarah had never left his thoughts. He'd spent those days making discreet inquiries at local shelters, even driving through downtown in the evenings, searching faces in the crowds of people who had nowhere else to go. The guest house behind his Beverly Hills mansion remained prepared, fresh linens on the bed, groceries stocked in the small kitchenette, waiting for an answer to his offer that he wasn't certain would come. Thursday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of December weather that made Los Angeles feel temporarily human. Marcus left his office earlier than usual, telling his assistant David that he had a personal appointment. David, who had worked with Marcus for 8 years and knew him well enough to recognize the signs of preoccupation, simply nodded and reminded him about the board meeting the following morning. The park looked different in the rain. Homeless camps had shifted to covered areas, and the usual foot traffic had thinned to people who had no choice but to be outside. Marcus found the bench where he'd first seen Sarah, now empty and slick with moisture. His heart sank. Perhaps she'd taken his offer as pity after all, or maybe she'd simply moved on to another part of the city, another survival strategy he couldn't understand. He was about to leave when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A figure, slumped against the base of a palm tree about 50 yards away, partially hidden by shadows. Something about the posture, the careful way the person was trying to remain upright while clearly struggling, made him walk closer. Sarah sat with her back against the rough bark, her eyes closed, breathing in shallow, rapid pants. The clothes she'd worn to the diner 3 nights ago were now damp and rumpled, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of exhaustion and hunger. In her lap, she clutched a small canvas bag that seemed to contain everything she owned. "Sarah," Marcus called softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on his face. When recognition dawned, she tried to sit up straighter, to compose herself into some semblance of dignity. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain on leaves. I was just resting." Marcus knelt beside her, noting the way her hands trembled and the rapid pulse visible at her throat. "How long has it been since you've eaten?" "I had some crackers yesterday," she said, but her eyes darted away from his, the lie transparent and desperate. "I'm fine. Really, I just needed to sit down for a minute." As she tried to stand, her legs buckled, and she would have fallen if Marcus hadn't caught her. Her body felt frighteningly light in his arms, all sharp angles and fragile bones beneath layers of clothing. Up close, he could see that her lips were pale, her breathing labored in a way that spoke of more than simple fatigue. "Sarah, when did you last sleep? I mean really sleep somewhere safe and warm?" She sagged against his support, the fight going out of her. "The shelter's been full. There was a waiting list, and I didn't want to take a spot from someone with children." Her voice broke on the last word, and Marcus realized she was close to collapse. "We're going to the hospital," he said, pulling out his phone to call. "And for an ambulance." No, Sarah protested weakly, her hand grasping his wrist with surprising strength. I can't pay for a hospital. I don't have insurance. They'll help you, Marcus interrupted firmly. And I'll handle the money. That's not something you need to worry about right now. But Sarah was already losing consciousness, her grip on his arm loosening as her eyes rolled back. Marcus caught her as she collapsed completely, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and he could feel her heart racing beneath his palm. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Paramedics arrived quickly, their professional calm a stark contrast to the panic. Marcus felt as he watched them work. They checked her vital signs, started an IV line, and loaded her onto a gurney with practiced efficiency. Marcus followed the ambulance to Cedars-Sinai, his hands gripping the steering wheel, as he tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The emergency room was a study in controlled chaos. Marcus paced the waiting area, his expensive shoes squeaking against the polished floor as nurses and doctors moved past him with purposeful urgency. He'd called David to cancel his morning meetings, but offered no explanation beyond family emergency. It wasn't entirely a lie. In the space of an hour, Sarah had become something more than a stranger to him. Are you family? The nurse asked when she finally approached him. Her name tag read Jennifer, and her eyes held the patient kindness of someone who delivered both good and terrible news as part of her daily routine. Marcus paused, unsure how to define his relationship to Sarah. I'm the one who brought her in, her friend. Jennifer nodded, consulting her clipboard. She's stable now, severe dehydration and malnutrition, but nothing that can't be treated. She's awake and asking for you. Marcus found Sarah in a narrow hospital bed, looking impossibly small beneath the white sheets. An IV drip fed fluids into her arm, and she wore a hospital bracelet printed with her name and medical record number. The plastic band seemed to symbolize something significant, official recognition of her existence in a world that had been ignoring her for months. How are you feeling? Marcus asked, settling into the visitor's chair beside her bed. Embarrassed, Sarah replied, her voice still weak but clearer than it had been in the park. And grateful. The doctor said you told them to do whatever I needed, that you'd handle the costs. Marcus waved dismissively. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Sarah said firmly, her eyes meeting his. They wouldn't. I've been invisible for 8 months, Marcus. People step around me on the sidewalk like I'm a piece of furniture. You're the first person who's looked at me and seen a human being. The honesty of her words hit Marcus harder than he expected. He thought about his own comfortable life, the way he could walk through the world, confident that his problems would be taken seriously, that his suffering would be acknowledged and addressed. Sarah had been denied even that basic dignity. The doctor wants to keep you overnight for observation, Marcus said, and when you're discharged tomorrow... He paused, choosing his words carefully. My offer still stands. The guest house, the job with the foundation if you want it. No strings attached. Sarah's hand moved to the hospital bracelet, rotating it around her thin wrist. The plastic was stark white against her skin, a temporary identity that would disappear when she left this place. I've been thinking about what you said at the diner, about second chances. And Tom used to tell his students that pride was a luxury they couldn't always afford. He said there was no shame in accepting help when you needed it, that the real shame was in being too proud to let people care about you. Tears gathered in her eyes. I think I've been too proud for too long. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. So what are you saying? I'm saying yes, Sarah whispered. To the guest house, to the job, to whatever chance you're offering me. I can't keep pretending I'm fine when I'm not. I nearly died today because I was too stubborn to admit I needed help. Relief flooded through Marcus, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. There are some practical things we'll need to work out. Getting you some clothes, a phone, identification if you don't have it. I have my driver's license and social security card in my bag, Sarah said. I've been guarding them like they were made of gold. And I have some things, personal items, in a storage unit. I've been paying for it with the little money I could scrape together because," her voice caught, "because it has Tom's things, our wedding photos, his books, some furniture we bought together." "We'll get everything you need," Marcus assured her, "but right now you focus on getting better. The world can wait another day or two." A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Visiting hours are ending soon," she announced, but her tone was gentle. "You can come back in the morning when she's discharged." Marcus stood, then hesitated. "Sarah, I want you to know that this arrangement, it's not charity. I need someone who understands what people in crisis actually face, someone who can help design programs that really work. You're not accepting a handout. You're accepting a partnership." Sarah's fingers wrapped around the hospital bracelet, and for the first time since he'd known her, she smiled. A real smile that transformed her face and reminded him of the woman she'd been before loss had worn her down. "Partners," she agreed. "I can work with that." As Marcus walked through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and board meetings. Sarah's near collapse had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The thought of her dying alone under that tree, her dignity intact but her life extinguished, made him realize how high the stakes really were. This wasn't about solving someone else's problems to make himself feel better. This was about two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, when both were ready to take risks that might change everything. Sarah was risking her independence by accepting help. Marcus was risking his comfortable isolation by opening his life to someone whose pain might force him to confront his own. The hospital bracelet she wore would be removed tomorrow, but its significance would linger. It marked the moment when Sarah Martinez stopped being a homeless woman, sleeping in parks, and became someone worth saving. Not because Marcus was generous, but because she had finally allowed herself to believe she deserved to be saved. Outside, the rain had stopped, and stars were becoming visible through the breaking clouds. Marcus drove home to his empty mansion, knowing that tomorrow it would be a little less empty, a little less perfect, and infinitely more meaningful. In 24 hours, his life would begin to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine, all because a woman with tremendous dignity had finally found the courage to accept the help she so desperately needed. The guest house sat at the back of Marcus's property like a secret garden cottage, connected to the main mansion by a winding stone path lined with lavender bushes. Sarah stood at its threshold the next afternoon, her single canvas bag clutched in her hands, staring at what would be her first real home in 8 months. "The key is under the third planter from the door," Marcus said, maintaining a respectful distance while she absorbed the reality of her new circumstances. "But I had copies made for you." He handed her 2 sets of keys, one for the guest house and one for the main house, in case you need anything, or if you want to use the kitchen when I'm not around. Sarah turned the key in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal a space that seemed impossibly luxurious after months of shelter cots and park benches. The main room combined living area and kitchenette, furnished with a comfortable sofa, a small dining table, and everything needed for basic cooking. Through an archway, she could see a bedroom with an actual bed, covered in a white comforter that looked like it had never been used. "It's too much," she whispered, though she stepped inside anyway. The floors were hardwood, polished to a warm shine, and afternoon sunlight streamed through windows dressed in simple white curtains. Everything was clean and peaceful and hers. "It's exactly enough," Marcus corrected gently. "Elena, she manages the household for me. She stocked the refrigerator and pantry with basics. If you need anything else, just let me know." Sarah set her bag on the sofa and walked slowly through the space, touching surfaces as if to confirm they were real. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub and fluffy towels that smelled of lavender fabric softener. The bedroom contained not just the bed, but a dresser, a reading chair by the window, and a small desk where she could work or write. When you said guest house, I pictured something smaller, she admitted. My architect called it a granny flat. Marcus replied with a slight smile. I had it built when I first bought the property, thinking my foster mother might want to move to California. But Mrs. Chen was too attached to her garden in Oakland to relocate. The mention of his foster mother reminded Sarah that Marcus understood displacement, that his offer came from experience rather than mere sympathy. It made accepting his generosity feel less like charity and more like recognition. One person who had been homeless acknowledging another's right to shelter. I'll need some time to settle in, Sarah said. Maybe we could have dinner tomorrow. Night. In the main house, I mean. I'd like to cook for you, if that's all right. Marcus's expression softened. You don't need to earn your place here, Sarah. This is your home now, not a job interview. I need to contribute something, she insisted. I've been taking without giving for too long. It's not healthy for either of us. After Marcus left her to unpack, Sarah sat on the sofa and stared at her canvas bag. Everything she owned in the world fit into a space smaller than most people's gym bags. She unpacked methodically, 2 changes of clothes, toiletries in a plastic bag, a small Bible that had been Tom's, and a manila envelope containing her important documents. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped carefully in a plastic grocery sack, was a 5x7 photograph in a silver frame. Sarah held it for a long moment before unwrapping it, revealing a family portrait taken at a shopping mall studio 2 years ago. She and Tom flanked a 10-year-old girl with Sarah's dark eyes and Tom's gentle smile. Emma, their daughter. The child Sarah hadn't mentioned to Marcus because some losses were too enormous for first conversations. She placed the photograph on the bedside table, then immediately moved it to the dresser drawer. Some wounds needed privacy to heal properly, and Emma's memory deserved more than casual explanations to well-meaning strangers, even strangers who had saved her life. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside her window. She peered through the curtains to see Marcus talking with a woman in her 50s who carried herself with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing large households. Elena, she assumed. The housekeeper moved with purposeful grace as she directed 2 younger workers in the care of Marcus's extensive gardens. Sarah dressed quickly in her cleanest clothes and ventured outside, unsure of the protocol for encountering household staff. Her last experience with domestic workers had been as an employer herself, when she and Tom had hired a cleaning service twice a month for their modest Pasadena home. The power dynamics of her current situation felt foreign and uncomfortable. Good morning, Elena called out in lightly accented English, looking up from where she supervised the pruning of rose bushes. You must be Sarah. I'm Elena Morales. I take care of the house for Mr. Wellington. The introduction felt carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Sarah recognized the reserve of someone who had seen Marcus's charitable impulses before, and wasn't certain this arrangement would last any longer than previous ones. Thank you for stocking the guest house, Sarah said. Everything was perfect. Mr. Wellington is very generous with his friends, Elena replied, the emphasis on friends making it clear that Sarah's status remained to be determined. If you need anything, you can find me in the main house most mornings. Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries. She wasn't family, wasn't quite staff, but occupied some undefined middle ground that would require careful navigation. The realization both relieved and challenged her. She wouldn't be expected to integrate immediately into Marcus's world, but she also couldn't assume automatic acceptance. Later that afternoon, Marcus found her in the guest house kitchen, attempting to plan a dinner that would justify his generosity without overstepping her budget. She had walked to a nearby grocery store, still overwhelmed by the luxury of choice after months of food bank rations and occasional restaurant handouts. How was your first night? He asked, settling into one of the kitchen chairs. He'd changed from his business suit into jeans and a sweater, looking more approachable, but no less successful. Quiet, Sarah admitted. I kept waking up, thinking I needed to check for safety or that someone would make me leave. It's going to take time. To feel secure again, Marcus nodded, understanding the hypervigilance that came from too many nights spent vulnerable. Elena mentioned you went to the store. I hope you found everything you needed. She's protective of you, Sarah observed, chopping vegetables for a simple pasta dish. I get the impression this isn't the first time you've invited someone in. Crisis to stay here. Elena has worked for me for 6 years, Marcus said carefully. She's seen me make impulsive decisions before. Some worked out better than others. The admission hung between them, and Sarah set down her knife. What happened with the others? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh how much honesty their new relationship could bear. There was a veteran who stayed for 3 months, James. He had PTSD, was living in his car. I thought providing stability would help him get back on his feet. He paused. He wasn't ready for help yet. He stole some electronics and disappeared one night. Elena had to change all the locks. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. And you're wondering if I'll do the same thing? No, Marcus said firmly. I'm telling you so you understand that Elena's caution comes from caring about me, not from judgment about you. She'll need time to trust you, just like you need time to trust this situation. The honesty was both reassuring and sobering. Sarah appreciated that Marcus didn't pretend their arrangement was without risks, that he acknowledged the possibility of failure without letting it paralyze his willingness to try. I won't steal from you, she said simply. But I understand why she's concerned. They ate dinner at the small table in the guest house, the intimacy of the space making conversation easier than it might have been in Marcus's formal dining room. Sarah had prepared a simple meal, pasta with vegetables and a salad, but she'd set the table carefully, using the good dishes Marcus had provided, and adding a small bouquet of lavender from the garden. "Tell me about your foundation," Sarah said over dessert, store-bought cookies that she'd arranged on a proper plate. "What kind of work do you do?" Marcus's face lit with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for his business ventures. "We focus on transitional housing and job training for people experiencing homelessness, but most programs are designed by people who've never been homeless themselves. They make assumptions about what people need based on statistics rather than actual experience." "What kind of assumptions?" Sarah asked, genuinely interested. "That job training is the primary barrier to employment, for instance. In reality, most homeless people already have job skills. What they lack is an address for applications, a phone for contact, appropriate clothes for interviews, or transportation to get to work consistently." Marcus warmed to his subject. "We've been funding programs that address those practical barriers, but I keep feeling like we're missing something essential." Sarah set down her coffee cup, an idea forming. What if someone who'd actually been through the system helped design the programs? Someone who understood the real obstacles instead of the theoretical ones. "That's exactly what I've been thinking," Marcus agreed. "Would you be interested in consulting on some of our current projects?" "Not immediately," he added quickly. "Give yourself time to settle in first, but when you're ready, your perspective could be invaluable." For the first time since Tom's death, Sarah felt a spark of professional excitement. The work Marcus described aligned perfectly with her background in program coordination, while her recent experiences had given her insights no textbook could provide. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like to feel useful again." As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Sarah, I want you to know, whatever happens with the foundation work, this place is yours for as long as you need it. The two things aren't connected." After he left, Sarah washed the dinner dishes slowly, savoring the simple pleasure of hot water and adequate dish soap. Through the window, she could see lights coming on in the main house, Marcus settling into his evening routine. The sight was comforting rather than intrusive, proof that she wasn't alone in the world, that someone else existed in her orbit who cared whether she was safe. She retrieved the photograph from the dresser drawer and set it on the bedside table. Emma's face smiled back at her, frozen at 10 years old, unaware of the tragedy that would scatter their family to the winds. Soon, Sarah knew, she would need to tell Marcus about her daughter. But not yet. Some stories required more trust than a few days could build, and Emma's memory deserved more than casual revelation over dinner conversation. Tonight, it was enough to have shelter, to have purpose on the horizon, and to have someone who saw her as more than a problem to be solved. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself worthy of Marcus's faith in her. But for now, in her small, beautiful sanctuary, Sarah Martinez was finally home. A week into her new life, Sarah had established a routine that balanced independence with gradual integration into Marcus's world. She woke early to tend the small. Herb garden Elena had shown her behind the guest house, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing growing things. Afternoons were spent reading. Marcus had given her access to his extensive library, and evenings often included dinner together, either in the guest house or the main dining room. It was during one of these evening meals that Sarah found herself speaking more openly about Tom than she had with anyone since his death. "He would have loved this house," she said, looking around Marcus's study where they'd taken coffee after dinner. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Tom was always reading something, fiction, history, science articles he'd share with his students. He said a good teacher never stopped learning. Marcus listened from his leather chair, noting how Sarah's posture relaxed when she talked about her husband in past tense, rather than avoiding his memory entirely. "How long were you married?" he asked gently. 15 years. We met in college. I was studying business administration. He was getting his teaching degree. Everyone said teachers and business people were incompatible, but Tom understood numbers better than most accountants I knew. Sarah smiled, the expression reaching her eyes for the first time Marcus could remember. He balanced our checkbook, managed our investments, planned our budget. I handled the big picture stuff, and he took care of the details. That sounds like a good partnership. It was perfect, Sarah said, then caught herself. I know people say that about relationships after someone dies, but it really was. We complemented each other. When the school district started having budget problems, Tom took on tutoring jobs in the evenings. When I wanted to start my own consulting business, he researched the market and helped me write the business plan. Marcus found himself envious of the easy companionship Sarah described, the kind of deep partnership he'd never experienced himself. His relationships had been pleasant, but ultimately shallow, hampered by his difficulty trusting anyone with his vulnerabilities. "What kind of consulting did you do?" he asked. Non-profit program development, mostly. Small organizations that needed help structuring their services or applying for grants. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she talked about her professional life. I specialized in programs serving low-income families, food banks, housing assistance, job training. Tom used to joke that I was trying to save the world one spreadsheet at a time. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sarah's expertise in helping people facing the exact crisis she'd later experience herself. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, recognizing the passion that had been buried under months of survival mode. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our conversation regarding the foundation. Would you be willing to look at some of our current project proposals? Not as a formal consultation yet, just your perspective on what we might be missing." Before Sarah could respond, the doorbell rang. Marcus glanced at his watch, surprised by the late evening visitor. Elena had gone home hours ago, and he wasn't expecting anyone. "Marcus, we need to talk." David Chen's voice carried an urgency that made both Sarah and Marcus tense. David was Marcus's business partner and closest friend, but his unscheduled appearances usually meant problems. "Come in," Marcus called, then turned to Sarah. "David handles the business side of my foundation work. You should meet him anyway." David entered the study, his usual composed demeanor slightly frayed around the edges. At 45, he possessed the sharp intelligence and careful grooming of a successful attorney. But tonight his tie was loosened and his expression troubled. "I'm sorry to interrupt," David said, nodding politely to Sarah before focusing on Marcus, "but we have a situation that can't wait until morning." Marcus gestured for David to continue, and Sarah started to rise from her chair. "I should go, please." "Stay," Marcus said, then looked questioningly at David, who hesitated before nodding curtly. "The Peterson grant application was rejected," David began, settling into the chair across from Marcus. "Not because of the project merits, but because the Foundation Board has concerns about your recent personal decisions." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she was the personal decision in question. Marcus's expression hardened, and she recognized the same protective instincts that had driven him to help her in the first place. "What specific concerns?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully controlled. David glanced uncomfortably at Sarah. "They're questioning your judgment in bringing an unknown homeless individual into your home. The liability issues, the potential for fraud or theft, the impact on your professional reputation if something goes wrong." "Sarah has a name," Marcus said coldly, "and she's sitting right here." "I know that," David replied, frustration bleeding into his tone. "But Marcus, you have to understand how this looks from the outside. You've built your reputation on careful, measured philanthropy. Suddenly you're making impulsive personal rescues that could be perceived as what, David? As a wealthy man with poor judgment and possible ulterior motives." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Sarah stood abruptly, her face flushed with humiliation and anger. "I should never have accepted this arrangement. I'm making things complicated for you." "Sit down," Marcus said firmly, though his tone was gentle. "David, I think you're forgetting something important." Marcus walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, retrieving a small wooden box that Sarah hadn't seen before. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a Bronze Star medal, along with several other military decorations. "These represent 12 years of military service," Marcus said, holding the Bronze Star so David could see it. "2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I earned this particular medal for leading a rescue mission that saved 8 civilian contractors from a terrorist compound." David shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, I know your service record. What does that have to do with everything?" Marcus interrupted. "My entire adult life has been built on the principle that you help people in crisis, regardless of the personal risk or social conventions. That's what soldiers do. That's what decent human beings do." Sarah stared at the medal, understanding flooding through her. Marcus's disciplined approach to helping others, his ability to make quick decisions under pressure, his instinctive protective responses, they all made sense now. He wasn't playing at charity or trying to salve his conscience. He was acting according to principles forged under fire. "The Foundation Board doesn't need to understand my personal life," Marcus continued, returning the medal to its box. "They need to understand that I make decisions based on evidence and instinct, not on what's socially acceptable to people who've never risked anything meaningful to help someone else." David rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated, but also concerned. For his friend. "I'm not arguing with your motives, Marcus. I'm worried about the practical consequences. What happens if Sarah—" He caught himself and looked directly at her. "What happens if this arrangement doesn't work out? What happens to your reputation, to the Foundation's credibility?" "Then we deal with those consequences," Marcus replied. "But we don't make decisions based on fear of what might go wrong." Sarah had heard enough. "Both of you are talking about me like I'm a ticking bomb. Maybe that's exactly what I am." She turned to Marcus. "I appreciate everything you've done, but I won't be responsible for destroying your life's work." "Where would you go?" Marcus asked quietly. The simple question stopped Sarah's momentum toward the door. She realized with stark clarity that she had no backup plan, no safety net beyond Marcus's generosity. The shelters were still overcrowded, her storage unit rent was due in 2 weeks, and she had less than $30 to her name. "I don't know," she admitted, "but that's not your problem to solve." "Yes, it is," Marcus said firmly. "Because I made you a promise, and I don't break promises to people I care about. The admission that he cared about her shifted something in the room's dynamic. David looked between them with new understanding, recognizing that this arrangement had moved beyond simple charity into more complicated emotional territory. "Look," David said, his tone gentler than before, "maybe there's a middle ground here. Sarah, Marcus mentioned you have experience in non-profit program development. What if we formalize your role with the foundation? Make you a consultant rather than just a house guest. It might address the board's concerns about impropriety while utilizing your expertise." Sarah looked at Marcus, trying to read his expression. "Is that what you want? To make this a business arrangement?" "I want you to be safe and have purpose," Marcus replied carefully. "If a formal job title helps other people understand why you're here, then that's fine with me. But it doesn't change the fundamental situation. You have a home here for as long as you need it." The offer was tempting, but Sarah recognized the underlying complexity. A professional relationship with Marcus would provide cover for their personal connection, but it would also create new pressures and expectations. She thought about Tom, about how he'd always encouraged her to trust her instincts, even when other people questioned her judgment. "I'd like to review some of your current projects," she said finally. "Not as a formal consultant yet, but as someone who's recently experienced what your programs are designed to address. If my input is valuable, we can discuss making it official." David nodded approvingly. "That's a reasonable approach. It gives everyone time to see how things work out." After David left, Marcus and Sarah sat in contemplative silence, both processing the evening's revelations. The military medals remained on the desk between them, a tangible reminder of Marcus's history of calculated risks in service of others. "Why didn't you tell me about your military service?" Sarah asked. "It's not something I talk about much. Too many people either want to treat you like a hero or assume you're damaged goods. Both reactions are uncomfortable." Sarah understood the desire to control how others perceived your defining experiences. "The medal! What did you do to earn it?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped. Then he began to speak, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone recounting events he'd revisited many times in memory. 8. American contractors were taken hostage by insurgents outside Baghdad. The situation was politically sensitive. Officially, we weren't supposed to risk military personnel to rescue private citizens. But they had families, people who were counting on them to come home. Marcus paused. "I volunteered to lead a small team in to get them out, and you succeeded. We succeeded, but it cost us. One of my soldiers was severely wounded, and we barely made it out ourselves. For a long time, I wondered if the risk was justified, if I'd made the right call." Sarah studied his face, seeing the weight he still carried from that decision. "Do you still wonder?" "Sometimes. But then I remember that 8 people got to go home to their families because we were willing to take that risk. Sometimes the right choice is the difficult choice, regardless of what other people think about it." The parallel to their current situation wasn't lost on either of them. Marcus was once again choosing to help someone despite potential consequences, guided by principles that prioritized human welfare over social convention or personal safety. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, "for telling me about the mission and for everything else." "Thank you for staying," Marcus replied, "for giving this arrangement a chance to work." As they said goodnight, Sarah felt the dynamics of their relationship shifting yet again. The external pressure from David and the foundation board had forced them both to articulate why this mattered to them, why they were willing to navigate the complications and risks of caring about each other. In her guest house that night, Sarah looked again at the photograph of her family, seeing it with a clarity. Tom would have understood Marcus's choice to help her, just as he would have understood her decision to accept that help. Both men shared a fundamental belief that people in crisis deserved dignity and support, regardless of how their circumstances might appear to others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began reviewing the foundation's work, stepping into professional territory where her recent experiences would be assets rather than sources of shame. Tonight, though, she allowed herself to feel something she'd almost forgotten existed, the security of being truly seen and valued by someone whose respect was worth having. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah began reviewing the Foundation's project. Proposals and her insights had already begun influencing their approach to transitional housing programs. She worked from Marcus's home office in the mornings, finding satisfaction in the analytical work that had once been her professional strength. The Foundation's mission felt personal now, informed by her recent experiences sleeping in shelters and navigating social services designed by people who'd never used them. It was while organizing files that Sarah discovered a photograph that had fallen behind Marcus's desk, a formal portrait of him at what appeared to be a charity gala, his arm around an elegant woman in an evening gown. The woman was beautiful in the polished way of someone accustomed to expensive salons and designer clothes, and her smile seemed calculated for cameras rather than genuine affection. "That's Rebecca," Marcus said from the doorway, making Sarah jump. She hadn't heard him approach, and she felt embarrassed to be caught examining his personal photographs. "I'm sorry, I was just organizing and it fell out of one of the folders." Sarah held out the picture, but Marcus didn't take it immediately. "My ex-fiancée. That was taken about 3 years ago at the Foundation's annual fundraising dinner." He accepted the photograph and studied it with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "We were engaged for 8 months. Sarah waited, sensing there was more to the story. In the weeks she'd been living here, she'd noticed that Marcus received very few personal calls, that his social calendar consisted mainly of business functions, and that the house felt designed for one person rather than a couple planning a life together. "What happened?" she asked gently. Marcus set the photograph on his desk face down. "Rebecca came from the same world I move in now. Old money, charity boards, country club memberships. She understood the social expectations, knew how to navigate the circles where my business operates." That sounds practical. It was practical, very practical. We attended the right events, supported the right causes, looked good in photographs together. Marcus sat in his desk chair, and Sarah noticed how his posture shifted when he talked about this period of his life, more formal, more guarded. "But Rebecca saw my charitable work as a hobby, something that reflected well on her social status, but shouldn't interfere with the important business of being wealthy." Sarah began to understand. She didn't share your values. She tolerated them as long as they didn't inconvenience her. "The breaking point came when I wanted to establish the Foundation as my primary focus rather than a side project. Rebecca made it clear that she'd signed up to be the wife of a successful businessman, not a full-time philanthropist who might actually get his hands dirty helping people." The story explained much about Marcus's carefully controlled personal life, his reluctance to trust easily, and his surprise at finding someone who not only understood his charitable impulses, but had experienced their necessity firsthand. "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "That must have been painful." "Mostly it was clarifying," Marcus replied. "I realized I'd been trying to fit into someone else's vision of who I should be, rather than being authentic to who I actually am." Their conversation was interrupted by Elena's appearance in the doorway, her usual composure slightly unsettled. "Mr. Wellington, there's a man at the front gate asking about Sarah. He says he's family, but he seems agitated." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had no family in Los Angeles, no one who should know where she was living. "What did he look like?" "Tall, maybe 40 years old, needs a shave, driving an old pickup truck. He knew your full name and said it was urgent family business." A terrible suspicion began forming in Sarah's mind. "Jake," she whispered, sinking into the nearest chair. "Oh God, how did he find me?" Marcus immediately moved to her side, recognizing the fear in her voice. "Who's Jake?" "Tom's brother. We haven't spoken since—" Sarah's hands began to shake. He shouldn't be here. There's no reason for him to be here unless... Elena, tell him Mrs. Martinez isn't available and that he needs to make an appointment through proper channels, Marcus instructed. Don't give him any information about where she's staying. Too late for that, Elena replied grimly. He saw her through the office window while we were talking. He's demanding to speak with her. Sarah stood on unsteady legs. I should go talk to him. If I don't, he'll just keep causing problems. Not alone, Marcus said firmly. If this man is causing you distress, you don't have to face him without support. They found Jake Martinez pacing outside the main gate, his appearance disheveled and his demeanor aggressive. At 42, he bore a superficial resemblance to his deceased brother, but where Tom had possessed gentle strength, Jake radiated restless anger. His pickup truck was parked haphazardly on the street, and he'd clearly been drinking. Well, well, Jake called out when he saw Sarah approaching with Marcus. Sister-in-law's really landed on her feet, hasn't she? From sleeping on park benches to shacking up with millionaires. Tom would be so proud. Sarah flinched at the crude characterization, but Marcus stepped slightly forward, placing himself between her and Jake's aggressive energy. You need to lower your voice and explain what you want. What I want is to talk to my brother's widow about family business that doesn't concern you, rich boy. Jake's attention focused on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. You think you can just disappear, Sarah? Stop returning my calls, ignore my messages? I lost my phone when I lost my house, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. I haven't gotten any of your messages. Convenient. Real convenient. Jake pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket pocket. Well, you can't ignore this. Court papers. The wrongful death lawsuit against the hospital is finally going to trial, and you need to be there. Sarah stared at the envelope as if it contained a snake. I told you I wasn't going to be part of that lawsuit. I don't want to relive Tom's death in a courtroom. It's not about what you want anymore, Jake snapped. You're named as a plaintiff, whether you like it or not. And when we win, and we will win, the settlement money belongs to Tom's family. Marcus frowned, beginning to understand the deeper dynamics at play. Are you saying Sarah isn't considered part of Tom's family? Jake's laugh was bitter. Sarah was Tom's wife, but she's not blood family, and she sure as hell isn't the mother of his children. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she took an involuntary step backward. Marcus caught her arm to steady her, noting how her face had gone white. Get off this property, Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned in military command. Now, this isn't over, Sarah, Jake called as he walked back toward his truck. You can hide behind your sugar daddy all you want, but you're going to have to face the truth eventually. Emma's death isn't going away just because you've got a new life. The mention of Emma's name broke something inside Sarah. She doubled over as if she'd been punched, a keening sound escaping her lips that made Marcus's blood run cold. He caught her as her knees buckled, supporting her weight as Jake drove away, his truck's engine roaring with unnecessary aggression. Elena appeared immediately to help guide Sarah into the house, her professional composure masking deep concern. They settled Sarah on the living room sofa, where she curled into a defensive position, her whole body shaking with suppressed grief. Sarah, Marcus said gently, sitting beside her but not touching, waiting for permission to offer comfort. Who is Emma? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Sarah's breathing was ragged, and she seemed to be fighting some internal battle about how much truth she could bear to reveal. My daughter, she whispered finally. Emma was my daughter. Marcus felt the world shift slightly, his understanding of Sarah's story restructuring itself around this revelation. A daughter she'd never mentioned, whose death had apparently contributed to the financial and emotional collapse that had left Sarah homeless. What happened to her? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sarah reached into her purse with trembling hands and withdrew a folded piece of construction paper, a child's drawing that she'd kept hidden among her most precious possessions. The artwork showed a stick-figure family, a man labeled Daddy, a woman labeled Mommy, and a small girl labeled Emma, standing in front of a house with a yellow sun shining overhead. At the bottom, in careful 10-year-old handwriting, "My Family" by Emma Martinez, age 10. "She drew this for Tom's classroom," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "He always displayed his students' work, but he put Emma's drawings in a special place, on his desk, because she was his stepdaughter, and he was so proud of her." Marcus studied the drawing, seeing in its innocent optimism the life that Sarah had lost. Not just a husband, but a daughter. Not just financial security, but a complete family unit that had been destroyed in ways he was only beginning to understand. Emma wasn't Tom's biological daughter, he asked carefully. "No, she was mine from my first marriage, but Tom adopted her when she was 3, and he was the only father she ever really knew. He loved her completely, and she adored him." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she spoke. "When Tom died, Emma was devastated. She was angry, confused, and I was so lost in my own grief that I couldn't help her the way she needed." The story was becoming clearer, and Marcus began to see the full scope of the tragedy that had brought Sarah to that park bench. What happened to Emma Sarah? She died 6 months after Tom. A car accident on her way to school. The driver ran a red light and... Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "Jake blames me. He says if I'd been taking better care of her, if I'd been driving her to school instead of letting her walk, she'd still be alive." Marcus felt a surge of protective anger toward Jake Martinez, understanding now why the man's appearance had triggered such terror in Sarah. Jake wasn't just a brother-in-law, demanding her participation in a lawsuit. He was the voice of her own self-recrimination, the external manifestation of guilt that had been eating her alive. "The wrongful death suit," Marcus said, pieces falling into place. "It's about Emma's accident, not Tom's heart attack." Sarah nodded miserably. "Jake convinced me to sue the driver and the city for inadequate traffic safety measures. He said we owed it to Emma to fight for justice. But I couldn't handle the depositions, the questioning, having said I was betraying Emma's memory." The full weight of Sarah's loss settled over Marcus like a blanket. She hadn't just been grieving a husband when he found her. She'd been carrying the guilt and trauma of losing a child, of surviving losses that would have broken most people entirely. "Is that why you ended up on the streets?" he asked gently. "The lawsuit? The legal fees? The missed work while I was dealing with lawyers and court? Dates, the medical bills from Emma's funeral. It all piled up so fast. I couldn't concentrate on anything except getting through each day. I lost my consulting contracts, fell behind on the mortgage, and when Jake kept calling, demanding I participate in the lawsuit, I ran. I couldn't face any of it anymore." Marcus understood now why Sarah had been so reluctant to accept help, why she'd maintained such fierce dignity even in desperate circumstances. She'd been punishing herself, accepting homelessness as penance for failing to protect her daughter. The child's drawing lay between them, a testament to happiness that had been too fragile to survive the random cruelties of life. Emma's innocent. Artwork represented not just what Sarah had lost, but what she'd been unable to forgive herself for losing. "Sarah," Marcus said carefully, "Emma's death wasn't your fault. Traffic accidents are random tragedies, not punishments for inadequate parenting." "You don't understand," Sarah replied, her voice hollow. "I was so lost after Tom died that I wasn't present for her. She needed her mother, and I was just going through the motions of living. Maybe if I'd been paying better attention, if I'd insisted on driving her that morning, maybe nothing would have changed," Marcus interrupted gently. "Maybe you would have been in the car too, and I would have lost the chance to know you. Guilt is just grief with nowhere to go, Sarah. It doesn't honor Emma's memory to destroy yourself with what-ifs." The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Marcus's phone, but he ignored it, maintaining his focus on Sarah's pain. She was crying now in earnest, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from grief too long suppressed. Marcus moved closer on the sofa, offering his hand, which she grasped desperately. "I miss her so much," Sarah whispered. "I miss them both so much, and I don't know how to live without them." "You learn," Marcus said simply. "One day at a time, one breath at a time, and you don't have to do it alone." As evening fell around, they sat together in the living room, where Sarah had finally revealed the full scope of her losses. Emma's drawing remained between them, no longer a secret shame, but a shared understanding of how completely life could change in an instant, and how much courage it took to keep breathing when breathing felt like betrayal of those who couldn't. The morning after Jake's unwelcome visit found Sarah sitting at the guest house kitchen table, staring at the legal papers he'd forced upon her. The court documents were dense with legal terminology, but the basic facts were stark. Emma Martinez versus City of Los Angeles and Harold Kingston, wrongful death suit, trial date set for January 15th. Less than 3 weeks away, Marcus found her there when he brought coffee, noting how she held the papers as if they might burst into flames. He'd spent a sleepless night processing everything she'd revealed about Emma, about the layers of loss and guilt that had driven her to the streets. The full scope of her tragedy made his own loneliness seem insignificant by comparison. "Did you read through all of it?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Most of it. Jake wasn't lying about the lawsuit proceeding whether I cooperate or not. Emma's death created a legal action that exists independently of my participation." Sarah's voice carried a flatness that Marcus recognized as emotional exhaustion. "But there are financial implications I didn't understand before." She handed him a business card that had been clipped to the legal papers. Morrison, Klein and Associates, Personal Injury Law. The card was slightly bent and showed signs of handling, as if Sarah had carried it in her wallet for months before, finally fleeing from its implications. "My lawyer," she explained, "former lawyer, Robert Morrison. He took the case on contingency, which meant I didn't have to pay legal fees up front, but it also meant that if we won, he'd take 40% of any settlement." Marcus examined the card, noting the Beverly Hills address and the prestigious firm letterhead. "That's standard for personal injury cases." "What changed?" "I changed. After 6 months of depositions and court filings and reliving Emma's death, in excruciating legal detail, I couldn't continue. Every meeting with Morrison meant discussing how my 10-year-old daughter died, analyzing whether the city's traffic signals were adequate, debating the liability of a driver who was texting while driving." Sarah's hands shook slightly as she spoke. "Morrison kept pushing for more detailed testimony, more medical records, more proof of Emma's lost future earning potential. He wanted me to quantify my daughter's life in dollar amounts." Marcus began to understand why Sarah had fled. "So, you withdrew from the case?" "I tried to, but Morrison had invested significant resources, expert witnesses, accident reconstruction specialists, medical consultants. When I told him I couldn't continue, he said I was legally obligated to see it through or reimburse the firm for their expenses." Sarah pulled another document from the stack. $37,000. Money I didn't have, especially after missing so much work to deal with the legal proceedings. The financial trap was becoming clear. Sarah had been caught between participating in litigation that was re-traumatizing her and owing money she couldn't pay for, withdrawing from it. Either choice led to financial ruin, but only one offered the possibility of settlement money that Jake clearly felt entitled to claim. "Where does Jake fit into all this?" Marcus asked. "He's Emma's nearest blood relative besides me. Under California law, if something happens to me, he could potentially claim survivor benefits from any settlement." Sarah's voice carried bitter understanding. "Jake convinced me to file the lawsuit in the first place, saying we owed it to Emma to hold people accountable for her death, but I think his real motivation was financial." Marcus felt a surge of protective anger. "He manipulated your grief to set up a potential payday for himself, maybe. Or maybe he genuinely believed the lawsuit would provide closure. Jake isn't evil, Marcus. He's just damaged in different ways than I am. He and Tom had a complicated relationship, and Emma's death hit him hard too. Sarah sighed, but regardless of his motives, the legal situation is still active. If I don't appear for the trial, the case could be dismissed, and I'd still owe Morrison's firm for their expenses. Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the complexities. What do you want to do? I want to disappear again, Sarah admitted. I want to pretend none of this exists and just live quietly in your guest house and help with the foundation work and never think about traffic accidents or legal settlements or Jake's anger ever again. But that's not really an option. No, it's not. Sarah met his eyes directly. Jake knows where I am now. He'll keep coming back, keep pushing, keep making my problems into your problems. I can't let that happen. Marcus stood and began pacing, his military training automatically shifting into problem-solving mode. Let's think about this strategically. What are the possible outcomes if you participate in the trial? We could win, in which case Jake would demand his share of any settlement. We could lose, in which case I'd still owe Morrison's expenses, but Jake would have nothing to claim. Or I could settle out of court, which Morrison has been pushing for months. And if you don't participate, the case gets dismissed for lack of cooperation from the primary plaintiff. I still owe the legal expenses, Jake gets nothing, and the driver who killed Emma faces no consequences. Marcus stopped pacing and looked at Sarah intently. Which outcome do you think Emma would want? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, and Marcus could see her struggling with emotions that had been carefully suppressed for months. Emma believed in fairness, she said finally. She used to get upset when kids at school were mean to each other, when teachers played favorites, when things weren't right. She would want the person responsible for her death to be held accountable. Then maybe the question isn't whether to participate in the trial, but how to participate in a way that honors Emma without destroying yourself. Sarah looked at him with something approaching hope. What do you mean? I mean, you don't have to face this alone. I could go with you. To meet with Morrison, help you understand your options, make sure you're not being taken advantage of. Marcus paused. I could also have David review the legal agreements to make sure your interests are being properly protected. The offer was generous, but also potentially dangerous to their relationship. Sarah recognized that allowing Marcus to become involved in her legal troubles would entangle him in the messy aftermath of her former life, potentially affecting his business reputation and foundation work. Marcus, you don't understand what you're offering. This lawsuit involves a wrongful death claim against the city of Los Angeles. It's going to be covered by local media. If I participate and you're seen as supporting me, it could look like you're using your wealth to influence the outcome. Or it could look like I'm standing by someone I care about during a difficult time, Marcus replied calmly. Sarah, I've been thinking about this all night. Your legal troubles aren't separate from who you are. They're part of the reason you were homeless when I found you. I can't help you rebuild your life while ignoring the problems that destroyed it in the first place. Sarah felt tears gathering again. But these were different from the anguished sobs of the previous evening. These were tears of gratitude mixed with fear. Gratitude for Marcus's support, but fear of the complications his involvement might create. Jake will fight us, she warned. He believes that settlement money should go to Tom's family, and in his mind that means him, not me. Let him fight, Marcus said firmly. We'll have better lawyers. That afternoon, they drove to Morrison's Beverly Hills office, a glass tower that spoke of successful litigation and expensive hourly rates. Sarah had called ahead to request a meeting, and Robert Morrison had agreed to see them immediately, clearly motivated by curiosity about her sudden reappearance and well-dressed companion. Morrison was younger than Marcus had expected, probably mid-40s, with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to extracting settlements from reluctant defendants. His office overlooked the city, and his handshake was firm enough to establish dominance without being obviously confrontational. Mrs. Martinez, I have to say, I'm surprised to see you, Morrison began, his tone carrying subtle reproach. When you stopped returning my calls 6 months ago, I assumed you'd decided to abandon the case entirely. I needed time to process my daughter's death, Sarah replied, her voice steadier than Marcus had expected. I'm ready to discuss options now. Morrison's attention shifted to Marcus. And you are? Marcus Wellington. I'm here to support Sarah and to ensure she understands all her options. Recognition flickered in Morrison's eyes. Wellington Tech, the foundation work. At Marcus's nod, Morrison's demeanor shifted slightly. Professional. Calculation replacing casual dismissal. Well, this is an interesting development. They spent the next hour reviewing the case details. Morrison explaining that the city's insurance company had made several settlement offers, the most recent being $400,000. After legal fees, Sarah would receive approximately $240,000, enough to pay off her debts and start rebuilding her life. The problem, Morrison continued, is that Jake Martinez is claiming standing as Emma's uncle and demanding a portion of any settlement. He's retained his own attorney and is threatening to challenge your legal representation of Emma's interests. Marcus frowned. On what grounds? He claims that Sarah's mental state following the deaths of both her husband and daughter makes her unfit to make legal decisions regarding Emma's estate. Morrison consulted his notes. He's suggesting that grief has impaired her judgment and that he, as Emma's blood uncle, should be appointed to represent her interests. The strategy was cruel, but potentially effective. Jake was essentially arguing that Sarah's grief disqualified her from advocating for her own daughter, while positioning himself as the rational family member motivated by justice rather than emotion. That's absurd, Marcus said. Sarah is Emma's mother and legal guardian. Jake has no standing to claim otherwise. Actually, he might, Morrison admitted reluctantly. If he can demonstrate that Sarah's decision to withdraw from the case was irrational, evidence of diminished capacity due to grief, a court might consider appointing a guardian ad litem to represent Emma's interests. Sarah felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her. Just when she'd found the strength to face her legal troubles, Jake had found a new way to weaponize her pain against her. What do we need to do? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the determination that had served him well in military operations. Morrison looked between them, clearly recalculating his approach based on Marcus's obvious commitment to supporting Sarah. We need to demonstrate that Sarah is competent to make legal decisions, that her withdrawal from the case was reasonable self-care rather than mental incapacity, and that her current circumstances show stability and sound judgment. You mean the fact that she's living with me, Marcus said bluntly. Among other things, yes. The fact that she's secured stable housing, that she's working. Morrison paused. You are working, aren't you, Mrs. Martinez? I'm consulting for Marcus's foundation, Sarah replied, helping design programs for people transitioning out of homelessness. Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting. Perfect. So we have housing stability, employment, and a clear connection between her recent experiences and her current work. That's exactly the kind of evidence we need to counter Jake's competency claims. As they left Morrison's office, Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexities of fighting Jake's challenge while also pursuing the original lawsuit. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The possibility that she might not have to face these battles alone. Are you sure about this? She asked Marcus as they waited for the elevator. Getting involved in my legal troubles could complicate your life in ways you haven't considered. Marcus took her hand, the gesture feeling natural despite the formal office setting. Sarah, my life has been empty for 3 years, ever since I realized I was living according to other people's expectations rather than my own values. Helping you fight for Emma's memory, that's exactly what I should be doing with my resources and influence. The elevator arrived, and as they descended toward the parking garage, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. For the first time since Emma's death, she wasn't running from the legal complications of her daughter's accident. She was preparing to fight for Emma's memory, armed with resources she'd never had before, and supported by someone who understood that some battles were worth the personal cost. Jake Martinez had found her, but he'd also inadvertently given her a reason to stop hiding from her past. The trial would force her to relive Emma's death one more time, but it would also provide an opportunity to honor her daughter's belief in fairness and justice. The business card in her purse no longer felt like a burden. It had become a tool for healing, a way to transform her grief into something that might prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. Marcus's hand in hers provided the strength she needed to stop running and start fighting back. The private investigator's report arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to Marcus's office, while Sarah worked quietly in the Foundation's conference room, reviewing grant applications. Marcus didn't see the envelope until David brought it to his attention, along with a stack of other documents requiring his signature. "This came addressed to you personally," David said, setting the thick manila envelope on Marcus's desk. "The return address is Henderson Investigative Services. Mean anything to you?" Marcus shook his head, slicing open the envelope with his letter opener. Inside was a bound report, professionally formatted with photographs and documentation that made his blood run cold as he began reading. The cover letter was brief and devastating. "Mr. Wellington, per the request of our client, Jake Martinez, we have conducted a comprehensive background investigation into the relationship between Sarah Martinez and yourself. Our findings reveal significant information regarding your company's previous business associations that directly relate to the Martinez family's legal situation. We believe these findings should be disclosed to all parties involved in the pending litigation. Please contact our office to discuss this matter at your earliest convenience." Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he opened the report, David watching his expression with growing concern. The first page contained a detailed timeline of Marcus's business investments from 2019 to 2021, including his partnership in a medical technology venture capital fund. Nothing unusual there. Marcus had been involved in several healthcare investments as part of his diversified portfolio, but on page 3, highlighted in yellow, was the connection that changed everything. Wellington Tech's investment fund had provided $2 million in startup capital to Advanced Medical Response Systems, a company that manufactured the emergency medical equipment used by Los Angeles County paramedics. The same equipment that had failed to save Emma Martinez on the morning of her accident. The report included photographs of the crash scene, medical examiner documents, and a detailed analysis of the paramedic response. According to the investigators' findings, the defibrillation unit in the ambulance that responded to Emma's accident had malfunctioned, preventing the paramedics from potentially stabilizing her cardiac function during transport. Advanced Medical Response Systems had later recalled that specific model due to systemic electrical failures. Marcus felt the world tilting beneath him as he read the technical details. His company's investment had helped fund the production of medical equipment that failed when Emma needed it most. The irony was crushing. His money, his business acumen, his success had indirectly contributed to the death of the child whose mother he now loved. "Marcus?" David's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" Marcus handed over the report without speaking, watching David's expression change as he absorbed the implications. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a physical presence. "This is why Jake hired a private investigator," David said finally. "He suspected some kind of connection between you and Sarah." "He was fishing," Marcus replied, his voice hollow, "and he found exactly what he was looking for. The most damaging aspect of the report wasn't the business connection itself, which could arguably be dismissed as coincidence. It was the timeline that followed. According to the investigators' research, Marcus had begun his downtown evening walks just 2 months after news reports about the defective defibrillation equipment became public. The suggestion was clear. Marcus had sought out Sarah deliberately, motivated by guilt rather than genuine compassion. "You have to tell her," David said quietly, "before Jake does." Marcus nodded, knowing David was right, but dreading the conversation more than anything he'd ever faced. How could he explain that his wealth had inadvertently contributed to Emma's death? How could Sarah ever trust his motives again, knowing that his first encounter with her might have been driven by subconscious guilt rather than simple kindness? He found Sarah in the conference room, surrounded by grant applications and looking more purposeful than she had since moving into the guest house. Her transformation over the past month had been remarkable, from the desperate woman he'd found, crying on a park bench, to a confident professional, contributing meaningfully to the foundation's work. The sight of her competent focus made what he had to tell her even more devastating. "Sarah," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "we need to talk about something important." She looked up from her work, immediately sensing the gravity in his tone. "What's wrong?" Marcus handed her the investigator's report, watching her face as she read the cover letter. Her expression shifted from confusion to dawning horror as she processed the implications. "I don't understand," she said, flipping through the pages with increasing agitation. "Why would Jake hire someone to investigate your background?" "Keep reading," Marcus said gently. "It gets worse." Sarah found the highlighted section about advanced medical response systems, and Marcus watched the exact moment when understanding hit her. Her face went white, and she dropped the report as if it had burned her hands. "Your company," she whispered. "Your money helped build the equipment that failed Emma." "Sarah, I had no idea." "No." She stood abruptly, backing away from the table. "No, don't you dare tell me this is all some horrible coincidence." Marcus rose slowly, recognizing the defensive posture of someone preparing to flee. "It is a coincidence, Sarah. I invested in that medical technology fund 3 years ago, long before Emma's accident. I never even knew the specific companies involved until I read this report." "But you knew afterward, didn't you?" Sarah's voice was gaining strength, fueled by an anger that had been building for months without a target. "You knew about the equipment failure, about the recall, about the lawsuit. That's why you started those walks downtown. You weren't looking for someone to help. You were looking for me, specifically." The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow because it contained just enough truth to be devastating. He had known about the medical equipment recall. It had been covered extensively in the business press, and he'd felt sick when he realized his investment had contributed to a product that had potentially cost lives. But he genuinely hadn't connected that knowledge to Sarah until this moment. "I swear to you, Sarah, I didn't know who you were when I approached you in the park. The connection between Emma's death and my business investments never occurred to me." "But it occurred to your subconscious, didn't it?" Sarah was crying now, but her tears were angry rather than heartbroken. "Some part of you knew. Some part of you was drawn to that park, to homeless people, to the idea of saving someone because you felt guilty about the people you couldn't save." Marcus wanted to deny it, but the timing in the investigator's report was damning. His evening walks had begun shortly after the news coverage of the defective medical equipment. Even if he hadn't consciously connected his investment to specific victims, the guilt might have driven him toward some form of penance. "Even if that's true," he said desperately, "it doesn't change how I feel about you now. It doesn't change the fact that caring about you has become the most real thing in my life. Doesn't it?" Sarah was gathering her belongings, shoving papers into her bag with shaking hands. "How can I believe anything you've told me? How can I trust that your feelings are genuine when our entire relationship is built on a lie?" "It's not built on a lie," Marcus protested. Maybe guilt brought me to that park initially, but everything that's happened since then has been real. My feelings for you are real." Sarah stopped packing and looked at him directly, her expression heartbreaking in its betrayal. "Marcus, your money killed my daughter. The equipment that was supposed to save her life failed because your company funded cheap, defective medical devices. And then, whether consciously or not, you found me and offered me charity to assuage your guilt. That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened." Sarah's voice cracked with the force of her emotion. "You turned me into your redemption project, Marcus. You made me dependent on you, grateful to you, maybe even falling in love with you, all because you needed to feel better about profiting from my daughter's death." The words hung between them like a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Marcus realized, with growing despair, that no matter what his conscious motivations had been, Sarah would never be able to separate his care for her from his potential guilt over Emma's death. "Where will you go?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't." "No," Sarah admitted, her anger giving way to the exhausted despair he remembered from their first meeting. "But I can't stay here. I can't accept your help knowing what I know now." Marcus felt something breaking inside his chest, a pain more acute than anything he'd experienced in his military service. "Sarah, please don't do this. Don't let Jake's manipulation destroy what we've built together." "Jake didn't manipulate anything," Sarah replied, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "He just revealed the truth. You want to help people in crisis because you feel guilty about contributing to their crises in the first place. I was never your partner, Marcus. I was your absolution." She walked toward the door, then paused without turning around. "Thank you for everything you've done for me. I know your intentions were good, but I can't be your good deed anymore." After she left, Marcus sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by the foundation work that had given their relationship purpose and meaning. The grant applications Sarah had been reviewing lay scattered across the table, annotated with her insights and recommendations. Her contributions to the Foundation's mission had been invaluable, but now they felt tainted by the knowledge that their partnership had been built on a connection neither of them had understood. The private investigator's report lay open beside him, its clinical documentation of tragedy and coincidence reading like a judgment on everything he'd believed about himself. Had he unconsciously sought out Sarah because of guilt over Emma's death? Had his desire to help people in crisis been motivated by selfless compassion or selfish need for redemption? The questions would haunt him through the long afternoon as he waited for Sarah to return, hoping she might reconsider her decision to leave. But as evening fell and the guest house remained dark, Marcus began to understand that some betrayals, even unintentional ones, created wounds too deep for explanation or apology. Outside, Los Angeles continued its restless existence, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its neighborhoods. But in a Beverly Hills mansion, a man who had tried to save someone discovered that sometimes the act of salvation could become its own form of destruction, especially when built on foundations neither party fully understood. The January air in downtown Los Angeles carried an unusual chill that cut through Sarah's jacket as she sat on the same park bench where Marcus had first found her. 3 days had passed since she'd walked out of his house, and the familiar weight of homelessness had settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Her small canvas bag sat beside her, containing the same meager possessions that had defined her world before Marcus had offered her sanctuary. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd returned to the exact spot where her transformation had begun, as if the circular path might somehow lead to different conclusions. But the bench felt different now, harder and less forgiving, because she knew what comfort looked like and understood exactly what she'd given up. The nearby homeless camp had changed in her absence. New faces had appeared, while others had disappeared, and the informal community had shifted in ways that reminded her how transient this existence really was. She'd been welcomed back without questions, but the women she'd known before looked at her with curiosity about her temporary disappearance and return. "You clean up nice," said Rita, a 60-year-old woman whose mental illness had put her on the streets after her disability benefits were cut. "Figured maybe you'd found someone to take you in." "It didn't work out," Sarah replied, the understatement feeling enormous in her throat. Rita nodded with the understanding of someone who'd experienced too many false hopes. "They never do, honey. People like us, we're too damaged for the regular world. Best to know that up front." But Sarah wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Living with Marcus hadn't failed because she was too damaged. It had failed because their relationship had been built on a foundation neither of them had understood. The question that kept her awake in her sleeping bag was whether that foundation had been poisoned from the beginning, or whether it could be rebuilt on more honest ground. Meanwhile, Marcus had spent the same 3 days in a state of focused desperation that Elena had never seen before. He'd barely eaten, had cancelled all business meetings, and had turned his home office into a war room filled with legal documents, medical reports, and investigative materials. David found him there each morning, surrounded by evidence of his obsessive research into the connection between his investments and Emma's death. "You have to eat something," Elena said, bringing him coffee and a sandwich he wouldn't touch. "This isn't healthy, Mr. Wellington. I need to understand what really happened," Marcus replied, not looking up from the medical examiner's report he was studying for the 10th time. "The investigator's timeline doesn't make sense. If the defibrillation equipment failed, why? Wasn't that mentioned in the original accident report?" David entered the office, carrying a thick folder that he set down carefully beside Marcus's coffee cup. "I had our legal team pull Emma's complete medical records from the hospital," he said. "You're not going to like what they found." Marcus opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Inside were Emma's emergency room records, the paramedic response logs, and most importantly, the equipment failure reports that had been filed after her death. The documents painted a picture far more complex than the private investigators' report had suggested. "The defibrillation unit did malfunction," David explained, pointing to a specific section of the paramedic report. "But not in the way the investigator claimed. The equipment didn't fail catastrophically. It delivered inconsistent power levels that may have prevented optimal cardiac resuscitation." Marcus studied the technical specifications, his background in technology helping him understand the engineering failure that had affected Emma's treatment. "So it wasn't a complete system failure?" "No. And here's the crucial part. Emma's cardiac arrest wasn't caused by the car accident itself. She died from an undiagnosed heart condition that the trauma triggered. Even with perfect medical equipment, her survival chances were less than 20%. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emma's death hadn't been caused by defective equipment his company had funded. It had been caused by a rare genetic condition that no one had known she possessed. The defibrillation unit's malfunction had been a contributing factor, but not the primary cause of her death. "Why wasn't this in the lawsuit documents?" Marcus asked. "Because Morrison, Sarah's lawyer, focused on the equipment failure as the most winnable angle. Suing for medical malpractice based on an undiagnosed genetic condition is much harder than proving equipment malfunction contributed to wrongful death." David paused, letting Marcus absorb the implications. "The settlement negotiations have been based on flawed premise." Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief and renewed desperation. His company's investment hadn't directly caused Emma's death, but Sarah had fled before learning this crucial information. She was somewhere on the streets of Los Angeles, believing he had profited from her daughter's death, while the truth lay buried in medical records that revealed the tragedy's true complexity. "I have to find her," Marcus said, standing abruptly. "She needs to know what really happened." "Marcus," David said gently, "even if you find Sarah and explain about Emma's heart condition, it doesn't change the fundamental problem. Your subconscious guilt about the equipment investment may still have driven you to seek her out initially. That's what she can't forgive. The possibility that your care for her was motivated by guilt rather than genuine affection. The observation forced Marcus to confront the question he'd been avoiding. Had his evening walks through downtown been motivated by subconscious guilt over his investment in medical equipment? Had he been unconsciously seeking opportunities for redemption when he encountered Sarah? He closed his eyes, trying to remember his emotional state during those early walks. The honest answer was that he didn't know. The timing was suggestive, but motivations were complex, especially unconscious ones. What he did know was that whatever had originally drawn him to that park bench, his feelings for Sarah had evolved into something genuine and transformative. "I need to see her," he said finally. Not to convince her of anything, but to give her the information she needs to make an informed decision about the lawsuit. Elena, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mr. Wellington, perhaps you should consider that Sarah might not want to be found. Sometimes people need space to think without interference from those they're thinking about." The wisdom in Elena's words was painful but accurate. Marcus's impulse was to pursue Sarah, to explain and persuade and fight for their relationship. But perhaps the most loving thing he could do was respect her need for distance while ensuring she had access to the truth when she was ready for it. "What if I left the medical records with her lawyer?" Marcus asked. "Morrison needs to know about Emma's heart condition anyway. It affects the entire basis of the lawsuit." David nodded approvingly. "That's a much better approach. Give Sarah the information she needs without pressuring her to respond to you personally." That afternoon, Marcus drove to Morrison's Beverly Hills office, carrying Emma's complete medical records and a letter he'd written to Sarah explaining what the documents revealed. Morrison's reaction to the cardiac condition information was predictably frustrated. The revelation significantly weakened the equipment malfunction case he'd been building for over a year. "This changes everything," Morrison admitted, reviewing the hospital records. "If Emma died primarily from an undiagnosed heart defect rather than equipment failure, our damages calculation is completely different." "What does that mean for Sarah?" Marcus asked. "It means the city's settlement offer becomes much more reasonable. We're talking about contributing factors to a tragic accident rather than primary causation of wrongful death." Morrison paused, considering the implications. Frankly, Sarah might be better off accepting the current settlement rather than risking a trial where these medical records could significantly reduce any potential jury award. Marcus left Morrison's office feeling simultaneously hopeful and heartbroken. The medical evidence would help Sarah resolve her legal troubles more favorably, but it also meant she might choose to accept the settlement and disappear from Los Angeles entirely, using the money to start fresh somewhere far from the complexities of their relationship. The trial date was now just 2 weeks away, and Marcus knew that Sarah would have to surface soon to make decisions about her legal representation. The approaching deadline created urgency that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with justice for Emma, for Sarah, and for the truth about what had really happened on the morning a 10-year-old girl's heart had stopped beating. Meanwhile, Sarah spent her evenings walking through the same neighborhoods where Marcus had once conducted his own restless searches. She passed the diner where they'd shared their first real conversation, the hospital where he'd supported her through her collapse, and the streets of Beverly Hills where his mansion stood like a fortress of possibility she'd abandoned. The other homeless women had stopped asking about her temporary disappearance, but Sarah caught them watching her sometimes, recognizing the signs of someone wrestling with decisions that could change everything. She'd experienced genuine love and security for the first time since Tom and Emma had died, but she'd also learned that even the most generous impulses could be complicated by unconscious motivations. The legal documents Jake had served her remained In her bag, a constant reminder that time was running out for indecision. Soon, she would have to choose between facing the trial that Morrison had prepared or accepting whatever settlement the city offered. Either choice would provide closure to the legal chapter of her grief, but neither addressed the more complex question of whether she could rebuild her life with someone whose care might always be shadowed by questions about its origins. As January's cold nights grew longer, Sarah found herself thinking not about Marcus's potential guilt, but about Emma's, drawing that still lay hidden in her belongings. The stick-figure family, with their simple smiles and yellow sun, reminded her that love, even when complicated by loss and circumstance, remained the most powerful force for healing she'd ever experienced. The question was whether she had the courage to trust it again, knowing that some wounds might never fully heal but could still be tended by hands that cared enough to try. The Los Angeles County Courthouse buzzed with pre-trial activity as Sarah sat in the hallway outside Courtroom 7, wearing a navy suit that Morrison had insisted she purchase for the proceedings. The familiar weight of financial worry pressed against her chest. The suit had cost money she didn't have, charged to a credit card she'd hoped never to use again. But Morrison had been adamant that her appearance would influence the jury's perception of her credibility as a grieving mother seeking justice for her daughter. Marcus found her there an hour before the scheduled hearing, carrying a leather portfolio that she recognized from his foundation work. They hadn't spoken since she'd left his house 2 weeks ago, but the sight of him in his impeccably tailored suit reminded her of the morning they'd first visited Morrison's office together, when their partnership had felt natural rather than complicated by hidden connections. "Sarah," he said, settling into the chair beside her, "Morrison said you decided to go through with the trial." "The settlement offer was reduced after those medical records were disclosed," she replied without looking at him. "Morrison thinks we can do better with a jury trial now that we understand what really happened to Emma." Marcus opened his portfolio and withdrew a document that made Sarah's breath catch. The legal settlement papers bore the official seal of Los Angeles County and contained terms that seemed almost too good to believe. $650,000 in damages, with an admission of contributing negligence from both the city and the medical equipment manufacturer. "How did you?" Sarah began, then understood. "You negotiated this separately." David's legal team worked with Morrison to present a unified case that included the new medical evidence about Emma's heart condition. The city realized their liability exposure was much higher once they understood the full scope of the equipment malfunction and the hospital's failure to properly document Emma's cardiac event. Sarah studied the settlement terms, noting that the amount would not only resolve her legal troubles, but provide genuine financial security for the first time since Tom's death. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because justice for Emma shouldn't depend on whether we can work out our personal relationship," Marcus replied simply. "What happened to your daughter was preventable, and the people responsible should be held accountable." Before Sarah could respond, Morrison appeared in the hallway, flanked by Jake Martinez and a lawyer she didn't recognize. Jake's expression was thunderous as he approached their seating area, clearly having learned about the settlement negotiations from which he'd been excluded. "This is bullshit, Sarah," Jake said loudly enough to draw stares from other people waiting in the corridor. "You can't just cut me out of Emma's case because your rich boyfriend wants to play hero." "Mr. Martinez," Morrison interjected, "you have no legal standing in this matter. Emma's mother is the sole plaintiff, and she has every right to accept or reject settlement offers as she sees fit." Jake's lawyer, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit who clearly worked for much lower stakes than Morrison, stepped forward. "My client has invested significant emotional energy in seeking justice for his niece. He deserves consideration in any settlement discussions." Marcus stood, his military bearing evident as he faced Jake directly. "What you deserve is honesty about your motivations. This lawsuit was never about justice for Emma. It was about positioning yourself to claim survivor benefits if something happened to Sarah. That's a lie, Jake snarled, but his face flushed in a way that suggested Marcus had struck close to the truth. Is it? Marcus continued calmly. Because according to the investigator you hired, you've been researching California's inheritance laws regarding stepchildren and their biological relatives. You've also been monitoring Sarah's living situation to gather evidence of mental instability that might support a competency challenge. Sarah stared at Jake with dawning understanding. You hired that investigator to find dirt on Marcus, but also to build a case against me. You wanted to prove I was unfit to represent Emma's interests so you could take over the lawsuit yourself. Emma was blood family, Jake said desperately. I loved that little girl. I deserved to have a say in how her death was handled. You deserved to grieve her, Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength, but you didn't deserve to use her death as a way to solve your own financial problems. The bailiff announced that Court 7 was ready for proceedings, and Morrison gathered his materials. The settlement document remained in Marcus's portfolio, representing not just financial resolution, but vindication of Sarah's right to advocate for her daughter's memory. Sarah, Morrison said quietly, we still have time to accept the settlement rather than go to trial. The terms are excellent, and it avoids the emotional trauma of testifying about Emma's death. Sarah looked at the courtroom doors, then at Jake's angry face, then at Marcus's steady presence beside her. For 18 months, she'd been running from the legal complications of Emma's death, allowing grief and guilt to silence her voice when it came to demanding accountability for her daughter's preventable death. No, she said firmly, I want to testify. I want a jury to hear about Emma, about who she was and what she meant to the world. Jake's right about one thing. Emma deserves justice. But justice means her story being told by someone who loved her completely, not by someone who saw her death as an opportunity. Marcus felt a surge of pride and admiration as he watched Sarah transform from the broken woman he'd found on a park bench into an advocate willing to fight for her daughter's memory. Whatever complications existed between them personally, her courage in this moment reminded him why he'd been drawn to her strength from their very first conversation. As they entered the courtroom together, the settlement document in Marcus's portfolio remained unsigned but available, a safety net that gave Sarah the freedom to seek the justice she'd been too broken to pursue before. The trial would be emotionally grueling, but she would face it with resources, support, and the clear knowledge that Emma's death had meaning beyond the financial calculations that had defined too much of the legal process. The court clerk's voice echoed through the formal chamber. The case of Martinez versus City of Los Angeles is now in session. And for the first time since Emma's death, Sarah felt ready to fight for her daughter's memory with the full force of a mother's love, backed by the resources necessary to demand real accountability. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning with a verdict that awarded Sarah $425,000 in compensatory damages, along with the court's formal acknowledgement that systemic failures in emergency medical response had contributed to Emma's death. Jake's challenge to Sarah's competency was dismissed entirely, with the judge noting that her testimony had been both cogent and deeply moving. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood in the afternoon sunlight, holding the official judgment document, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. For the first time in over a year, she had legal closure regarding Emma's death, financial security, and, perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that she had found the strength to fight for her daughter's memory when it mattered most. Marcus waited near his car, giving her space to absorb the victory, while remaining available if she needed support. The trial had lasted only 1 day, but it had required Sarah to relive Emma's final moments in excruciating detail, describing her daughter's personality, dreams, and the devastating impact of her loss. Marcus had watched from the gallery as Sarah transformed before the jury's eyes from a grieving mother into a powerful advocate demanding accountability. "Thank you," Sarah said as she approached him, the judgment document still clutched in her hands, "for the settlement backup, for making sure Morrison had all the medical records, for everything." "You didn't need my help in there," Marcus replied. "Your testimony about Emma was incredibly powerful. That jury understood exactly who they were fighting for." Sarah looked back at the courthouse steps where Jake stood with his lawyer, both men clearly frustrated by the outcome. Jake's attempt to claim a portion of the settlement had been decisively rejected, and his accusations about Sarah's mental state had backfired spectacularly when contrasted with her composed, articulate testimony. "He really believed I was unfit to represent Emma's interests," she said, watching Jake's angry gestures as he spoke with his attorney. "Part of me wonders if he was right. I did run away from the legal process for months." "You took time to heal," Marcus corrected gently. "There's a difference between being unfit and being overwhelmed by trauma. What you did in that courtroom today, that took tremendous courage." They drove through Los Angeles in comfortable silence, the weight of the day's emotional intensity settling between them. Sarah had accomplished what she'd thought was impossible. She'd faced the legal system that had seemed determined to reduce Emma's life to financial calculations and emerged with both justice and dignity intact. "Where would you like me to take you?" Marcus asked as they approached downtown. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond immediate transportation needs. Sarah had been staying at a women's shelter since leaving Marcus's house, but the settlement money meant she could afford her own apartment, could rebuild her life independently of anyone else's charity or complicated motivations. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah replied slowly, "about your walks through downtown, about whether guilt over the medical equipment investment drove you to approach me initially." Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That it doesn't matter." The simple statement surprised them both. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. "Marcus, I spent 18 months punishing myself for Emma's death, convinced that better parenting might have prevented a genetic heart defect I didn't know existed. Self-recrimination is seductive because it gives us the illusion of control over random tragedies." Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, recognizing that this conversation required his complete attention. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that even if guilt initially drew you to that park bench, what happened between us afterward was real. You didn't manufacture the respect you showed me, or fake the way you listened to my stories about Tom, or pretend to care about foundation work that genuinely helped people." Sarah turned in her seat to face him directly. "You gave me back my sense of worth when I thought it was gone forever." Marcus felt hope stirring in his chest, but he forced himself to remain cautious. "What does that mean for us?" Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew something that made Marcus's breath catch. The key to his mansion that he'd given her weeks ago, which she'd carried even after leaving his house. The small piece of metal seemed to hold enormous symbolic weight as she held it between them. "It means I want to come home," she said simply. "Not as your charity case, not as your redemption project, but as someone who loves you and wants to build a life with you based on who we actually are, rather than the circumstances that brought us together." Marcus took the key from her hands, their fingers touching briefly in a moment that felt like a promise. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. What I feel for you has nothing to do with guilt or obligation. You've made me a better person, challenged me to think more deeply about what my wealth should accomplish, shown me what real courage looks like." "I know," she replied, smiling for the first time since the trial began. "That's why I kept the key. Even when I was angry and hurt and convinced our relationship was built on deception, some part of me knew that what we'd shared was genuine." They sat in the parked car as Los Angeles continued its restless existence around them. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment to heal wounds that had seemed permanent. The settlement money would provide Sarah with independence, but independence without connection felt empty after experiencing the depth of partnership they'd discovered together. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she'd rarely heard from him. "I love you. Not because I feel guilty about Emma's death, not because I need to save someone, but because you're the strongest, most dignified person I've ever met, and my life is infinitely better with you in it." Sarah leaned across the car's center console and kissed him, the gesture carrying all the weight of choice rather than circumstance, of love earned through mutual respect and shared struggles. When they separated, she was crying, but these tears were different from all the others she'd shed, tears of relief, of hope, of the possibility that happiness could still exist after tremendous loss. The key to his mansion remained in Marcus's palm, no longer a symbol of charity but of home, a place where two people who had found each other could build something lasting from the ashes of their separate tragedies. March arrived in Los Angeles with the kind of gentle warmth that made the city's reputation for perfect weather seem understated rather than exaggerated. In the backyard of Marcus's Beverly Hills mansion, Sarah knelt beside a freshly planted vegetable garden, her hands deep in the rich soil as she carefully transplanted tomato seedlings that would bear fruit in the summer months ahead. "The basil should go over there," Marcus suggested, pointing to a sunny corner near the guest house that had become Sarah's office space. "Elena says it grows better with morning sun and afternoon shade." Sarah looked up at him, noting how the months since the trial had changed his bearing. The careful formality that had once characterized his interactions with the world had given way to genuine ease, and he moved through his own property now, like someone who finally felt at home in his life, rather than merely inhabiting it. "Elena's been giving me gardening advice for weeks," Sarah replied, brushing dirt from her palms. "I think she's decided I'm staying permanently." "Are you?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah gestured toward the foundation office they'd established in the renovated guest house, where her title plaque read, "Co-Director, Wellington Foundation for Housing Innovation." The transformation from charity recipient to equal partner had been gradual but complete, built on Sarah's expertise in non-profit development and her first-hand understanding of the systems they were working to improve. "I'm exactly where I belong," she said simply. Their work together had evolved far beyond the initial consulting arrangement David had suggested. Sarah's insights into the practical barriers facing homeless individuals had revolutionized the Foundation's approach, leading to programs that addressed not just housing, but the complex web of documentation, communication, and transportation. Challenges that kept people trapped in cycles of instability. Their pilot program had helped 47 people transition into permanent housing over the past 3 months, with a success rate that was drawing attention from policymakers across California. "The city council meeting went well yesterday," Marcus said, settling onto the garden bench they'd installed between the vegetable plots. "They approved funding for 3 more transition centers based on our model." Sarah joined him on the bench, wiping her hands on the gardening apron Elena had given her for Christmas, a gift that had marked her official acceptance as a permanent member of the household. Through the kitchen window they could see Elena preparing dinner, humming contentedly as she worked. The housekeeper's initial wariness had transformed into genuine affection as she watched Sarah contribute not just to Marcus's happiness but to his sense of purpose. "David called while you were at the nursery," Sarah said. "The Peterson grant was approved, all of it, $2 million over 3 years." Marcus smiled, remembering how the Foundation Board's concerns about his personal decisions had evaporated once they saw the measurable impact of his partnership with Sarah. Board meetings now included Sarah, as a matter of course, and her presentations on program effectiveness had become the highlight of their quarterly reviews. "Speaking of the Peterson grant," Marcus said carefully, "there's something we need to discuss about the expansion plans." Sarah recognized the tone he used when approaching subjects that required delicate handling. What kind of something? The grant requires establishing satellite offices in 3 other California cities. It would mean significant travel, maybe relocating some of our operations. Marcus paused. It would also mean making our partnership completely official. The board wants clear leadership structure if we're expanding statewide. The implication hung between them like a question that had been building for months. Their personal relationship had deepened into the kind of mature partnership that grew from shared values and mutual respect. But they'd avoided formal discussions about marriage, perhaps because both had learned to be wary of assumptions about the future. "How official are we talking?" Sarah asked, though her smile suggested she already understood. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that made Sarah's breath catch. Inside was a diamond ring, elegant but not ostentatious, set in a simple platinum band that would complement rather than compete with the thin gold wedding ring she still wore in memory of Tom. The kind of official where people call you Mrs. Wellington at board meetings, Marcus said, his voice carrying both hope and vulnerability. The kind where we plant gardens, knowing we'll be here to harvest them together. Sarah stared at the ring, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been sleeping on park benches, believing her life had no value beyond the guilt she carried. Now she sat in a garden they'd planted together, wearing clothes that fit properly and using her professional skills to help people facing the same crises that had nearly destroyed her. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she'd expected. "Yes to all of it. The expansion, the partnership, the future we're building together." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, where it caught the afternoon light and cast small rainbows on the soil they'd been tending. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of them. Love that grew from careful cultivation rather than desperate need, commitment rooted in mutual choice rather than circumstance. That evening, they drove together through downtown Los Angeles, making their usual rounds to check on program participants and identify new people who might benefit from their services. It was during these drives that they often found individuals at their lowest points, people who needed to be seen and acknowledged before they could accept help. Near Pershing Square, Sarah spotted a young woman sitting alone on a bench, crying. Quietly in the gathering dusk, she had the same careful posture Sarah remembered from her own darkest days, the attempt to maintain dignity while everything fell apart around her. "Pull over," Sarah said, and Marcus immediately complied. They approached the woman together, Sarah taking the lead because she understood the fear and wariness that came with being approached by strangers when you were vulnerable. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Are you all right?" The woman looked up, startled, and Sarah saw her own reflection from a year ago, the intelligence that homelessness couldn't diminish, the dignity that poverty couldn't erase, the desperate hope warring with learned distrust. "I'm fine," the woman replied automatically, then caught herself. "Actually, no, I'm not fine at all." Sarah smiled, recognizing the honesty that was the first step toward accepting help. "My name is Sarah, and this is Marcus. We run programs for people who are going through difficult transitions. Would you like to get something warm to drink and talk about what's happening?" As they walked toward the nearby diner where she and Marcus had shared their first real conversation, Sarah felt the circle of healing completing itself. The woman between them, Jennifer, they learned, was facing circumstances remarkably similar to what Sarah had experienced, and would benefit from programs that Sarah's own experience had helped design. The garden they'd planted that morning would grow throughout the summer, tended by hands that had learned to nurture hope from the soil of loss. And in downtown Los Angeles, the work of helping people rebuild their lives would continue, carried forward by those who understood that sometimes the most broken among us could become the most powerful advocates for healing. Spring had indeed brought Sarah to live in Marcus's mansion, but as his equal partner in building a life that honored both their losses and their capacity for love. Emma's memory lived on, not in the guilt that had once consumed Sarah, but in the work they did together to ensure that other families facing crisis would find the support system that had been missing when Sarah needed it most.